This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
So I went and saw a double feature at the Paramount Theater here in Austin of Starship Troopers and RoboCop. Not in that order. RoboCop came first, 1987 film. Starship Troopers is about a decade later. It was hosted by Robert Rodriguez, who made El Mariachi, Spy Kids, and so forth. Fantastic. It was so much fun. He ended up calling Johnny Rico, an actor, or a character, in Starship Troopers, and asking him questions and live streaming it in the theater. So it was fun. But seeing those films, those old films, of course, RoboCop, which was one with which I was familiar when I was young, in the theater is an absolute blast. And the theater is a little bit wild. You don't go see a double feature like that and sit in silence. A lot of fun.
Hey, what do you sympathize with the bugs?
In Starship Troopers?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's such a difficult question, isn't it? We are even allowed to consider whether the humans started it by the news reporter in the movie. I'm not sure exactly what to do with any of that. I watched the movie not so far as sympathizing with the bugs or sympathizing with the humans, but understanding the movie to offer us a radical critique of war and human beings by way of the place of propaganda in the movie. You're being propagandized to the entire movie. So you are meant to come to sympathize with the human beings and cheer at the end of the movie when Neil Patrick Harris goes, "It's afraid." The smart bug is afraid. So part of the movie's purpose is manipulating you into that position while trying to make you conscious of the fact that you're being manipulated. So then when you leave the movie, you can be conscious of the way in which you are manipulated by the media regarding war, violence, atrocity. Because there's also, there's an execution of a criminal in the movie tonight, live streaming. They don't use the word streaming, but live streaming, execution of a murderer. So Verhoeven is always doing that between those two movies, RoboCop and Starship Troopers, respectively. You're watching TV. So it's crazy that RoboCop's set in Detroit. That's very important. You have a character who's resurrected to try and save Detroit from the evil corporation. I mean, it's a very anti-corporate movie, RoboCop is. And then in Starship Troopers, it's all global. We're well in the future, and the heroes are from Buenos Aires, and then it's in space. So spatially it's different, but nonetheless, what's consistent between both movies is the fact that individuals are being propagandized to by the media. It's really cool. I think both of them are visually stunning. The satire is ridiculous. You go back to the beginning of this way where there's satire and extreme gore or violence. And as far as I know, I could be incorrect, but as far as I know, American Werewolf in London really launches this, where you're seeing extreme violence and it's so absurd that you're meant to laugh at it. And that definitely happens in RoboCop. In the Verhoeven edition, Mr. Kinney, who's junior executive at Omni Consumer Products, gets killed by Ed 209 on the debut of Ed 209, as Ed 209 malfunctions, unfortunately. And Ed 209 just doesn't stop shooting. He shoots Mr. Kinney like 75 times. And Robert Rodriguez was talking about the studio execs decided to edit that scene and make it where Mr. Kinney is shot fewer times. And it's more violent and startling that way. Whereas the way Verhoeven shot it, he just keeps getting shot. And you're forced to look at it and just go, this is absurd. Everything here is to the point of parody. But it's by way of that parody that you come to see the truth in it, of it's entirely conceivable that we're so desensitized by violence, that the media is perpetuating it at the same time that it's saying, horrible things are happening. Go buy a robotic heart. We care. Horrible things are happening. This cop is in a coma. Get well soon, Officer Chuck. It's this weird juxtaposition throughout all of the movies that's just fantastic for stoking reflection. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it's tragic. I mean, Murphy is ruined. I mean, Murphy is set up by Omni Consumer. Peter Weller's character is set up by Omni Consumer Products to go to the most violent police precinct in old Detroit because they garnered from his profile that he was an apt candidate for the RoboCop program. So the corporation takes this man who has this psychological profile, et cetera, and just throws him into violence in the hopes that all the violence will get him, and then they'll have fresh meat for the grinder that is the RoboCop program. And he loses his family. I mean, he's completely alienated from everything. This is where I think the 14 RoboCop is fantastic. The 2014 RoboCop is not universally loved, but neither was the original RoboCop when it came out. They're different movies, the two RoboCops, but I like the second one quite a bit. And there's a fantastic scene where our RoboCop insists that Gary Oldman show him to himself. And so all of the RoboCop appendages and armor are stripped away as he's looking in a mirror at himself. And I believe he says, "Oh, Christ." Oh, like he cries out loud to Christ upon seeing himself as lungs contained in this clear plastic chamber, esophagus, and part of his head. And so then here's the question of, well, what is a man? And what can other human beings do to dehumanize other human beings for the sake of their own ends? In the case of the new RoboCop, it's Michael Keaton's desire, probably ambition, I would guess, to do this. So you have to wonder how much then RoboCop has in common with something like Frankenstein or the Birthmark. These people who want to control things. And maybe they want to bring about a better society, Michael Keaton in the new RoboCop. But at least in the original RoboCop, there's no question. Omni Consumer Products just wants to get paid. Yeah. They just want to make money. So, I mean, they're both great movies, and it's fantastic to go see them in the theater with hundreds of other people who are back there geeking out at them as well. It was a just demonstrably older crowd. The only young people were there were teenagers who were dragged there by their parents.
I'm looking at the frame of Gary Oldman in front of this sort of dissected man.
Yeah, that's the scene I was talking about.
Head, the lungs, and a third organ. Looks like about where his stomach would be.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's the scene I'm talking about. It's if you don't get goosebumps when you see that scene, you're not paying attention. It's absolutely frightening.
Outstanding.
So we've read several Federalist papers up to Federalist Paper 23 thus far, and we have said a few times, hey, we should be reading some anti-Federalists. So today, Aaron and I decided to read Brutus 1, one of the most famous anti-Federalists, probably the best of the anti-Federalists, Brutus, offered us this first essay about 2 weeks before Publius offers us the first Federalist paper. Brutus wrote his first essay on October 18th, 1787.
So, Mike, I'm going to ask you a question that has a double meaning. One of them, I think, is more important than the other. Who was Brutus?
Well, what's fun is I would like to go even a little bit behind that. Who were the anti-Feds?
Sure.
Let's think about names for a moment. The anti-Feds received their name from their opponent, and that's not really a good sign. The supporters of the Constitution, that is to say the Federalists, gave the name anti-Federalists to the anti-Federalists. Now, regarding Brutus himself, the actual human being, we're not too sure about who that is. Some suggest it was a lawyer from New York named Robert Yates. Mr. Yates attended the first month of the Constitutional Convention, but he fled the scene he viewed as an unhappy one, made unhappy by a plan that would give far too much power to the proposed government. Now, some other historians and researchers suggest that Brutus was Thomas Treadwell. Maybe it was Abraham Yates. Some even suggest that it was Melancthon Smith. But to me, this is not as important as the pen name, Brutus. Now, this pen name, Brutus, could be Lucius Junius Brutus, who worked with Publius to establish Republican Rome. Or, on the other hand, this could be Marcus Brutus, who stabbed Julius Caesar several times, only to see the Republic end. So pick your Brutus. Is this Brutus the one who's here to rid us of Tarquinius Superbus and give us a republic? Or is it the one who's here to kill Caesar in the hope of saving the Republic and staving off tyranny? Either which way, the adoption of the name Brutus means that the Federalists themselves are anti-republican, perhaps even monarchists or Caesarists. Now, I'll point out this final thing. Brutus wrote 16 essays that were published in the New York Journal and the Weekly Register. Every essay, in one way or another, urged New Yorkers to reject the proposed Constitution. Hence, anti-federalists.
It's interesting to think the name Publius might be a reply to Brutus's essay. Publius could have replied by calling himself Tarquinius Superbus, could have replied by calling himself Caesar. Hamilton, I think, wrote essays under the name Caesar at one point during his career. Choosing the name of Publius says we are actually founding a republic. We are establishing self-government in the United States. It's a wonderful way of not turning Brutus on his head, but showing an inconsistency in the way that Brutus understands himself that's characteristic of the style of argument of the Federalists. You think you understand self-government, actually you don't. You think you understand energetic government, actually you don't.
Thank God they didn't choose the name Massachusettsensis, because then we'd all have to say that. The number of extremely learned people I've met who can't pronounce it and just give up on saying Massachusettsensis. There's a lot in a name.
And choosing, by the way, a name that is much less famous than that of Brutus.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Whether, I assume this was the case during the 1780s, it helps that there are two Brutuses. When you have a political problem involving a monarch or a tyrant, you call in a Brutus, you get sort of your problem.
Look, and we have an anti-Fed named Cato. Cato, one of the most brilliant examples of devotion to Republican government, who failed, unfortunately, as Caesar's forces overtake the forces of Pompey. Cato, after helping several escape, reads Plato's Phaedo and then kills himself. It's the most glorious example, according to Seneca the Younger, of virtue. And his devotion to freedom is found in Cato. And that's another wonderful anti-Fed, who we might read at some point or another. Do you think it's too early to say why we should read the anti-Feds, or should we address that now? Because that's sort of what I was getting at there.
Why should we read the anti-Feds?
Well, why do you? No, let me ask you. I ask you first. You've taught them. What do you think?
So the first thing is that it's going to give us a more thorough understanding of the Federalist by trying to raise the questions that Publius was trying to answer. Think about how many Federalist papers begin like this. We must reply to an objection raised. But second, there's a possibility that the anti-Federalists understand the Constitution in a way that Publius does not. And I think we might want to answer this question maybe toward the end, but I look at a federal government that resembles the one that Brutus fears, one that has administrative centralization, one that has overgrown the capacity of the states, one that has an enormous tax power that acts often at the prejudice of the states. Again, these are all things that we're going to raise in our conversation about Brutus I. So there's a possibility that Brutus was right about the Constitution.
But let me ask you. So you're saying you look today at the American government and see those things. Is that right?
I look today and see those things. I don't necessarily think it's because Brutus was right about the Constitution, but that's one way to think about whether comparing the Constitution of today with the Constitution of Publius, whether Brutus was right in his prognostications.
All along, right. I see.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's another question, which is these terms, centralization, a big term, federalism. Determining what they actually mean is impossible when you're just reading the Federalists, because they are working these terms out as they go along. Consider the question of what confederation means. Is confederation, federation, federalism, the sharing of power between the states and the national government? Or is confederation the sharing of power between the states, the administration of the general laws by the states? The first answer would be that, I think, of Publius. The second answer, that of the anti-federalists, particularly Brutus. But during the debate, these terms are being used not interchangeably by the different authors. So establishing how we understand these terms, thinking about a sort of history of the term federalism, is really only possible when you read the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Because the establishment of these terms in a way that Publius would understand is not a given, it's a victory in this debate. And it's a victory that I think is extremely significant, only less significant than the actual victory, that is the establishment of the Constitution by ratification.
This is great. Well, thank you so much. Well, with that said, Aaron, let's turn to Brutus I itself. Brutus I, as I said previously, October 18th, 1787, begins with a salutation to the citizens of the state of New York. Now, the first 4 paragraphs of this should be viewed as the introduction. Brutus is here framing the matter. And it's worth stating that the parallels between this and the later written Federalist Paper number 1 are wonderful. Both Brutus and Publius agree that the decision before the American people is a very important one, not only for the people who are alive then, but also for the generations to come. Brutus goes so far as to say, the most important question that was ever proposed to your decision or to the decision of any people under heaven is before you. So we saw that language in Federalist Paper number 1 of how much the fate of humankind seems to hang in the balance over the decision that these people are to make here. And we spoke of it even when we studied Federalist Paper number 1 way back when, of something along the lines of American exceptionalism. There's no question here that Brutus shares that view as well. This is a great way to call your audience to attention. You show them the gravity of the matter. The gravity of the matter of whether or not the United States will adopt the new Constitution and cease to be a confederation of 13 separate states and just become a series of states united under one federal head, led by the legislature with an executive and a judiciary, is a serious, serious moment. Because, as Brutus says in the 3rd paragraph, if the Constitution offered to your acceptance be a wise one, calculated to preserve the invaluable blessings of liberty, to secure the inestimable rights of mankind, and promote human happiness, then, if you accept it, you will lay a lasting foundation of happiness for millions yet unborn. Generations to come will rise up and call you blessed. You may rejoice in the prospects of this vast extended continent becoming filled with free men who will assert the dignity of human nature. You may solace yourselves with the idea that society in this favored land will fast advance to the highest point of perfection. The human mind will expand in knowledge and virtue, and the golden age be, in some measure, realized. But if, on the other hand, this form of government contains principles that will lead to the subversion of liberty, if it tends to establish a despotism or, what is worse, a tyrannic aristocracy, then, if you adopt it, this only remaining asylum for liberty will be shut up, and posterity will execrate your memory. How about this rhetoric, Aaron? Is it merely rhetoric, or is the matter this grave? I think I asked you the same question when we did Fed 1.
No, it's amazing. It seems even higher than the rhetoric in Federalist 1, which I take to be very interesting in conjunction with something that Publius and Brutus agree on. At the beginning of the 3rd paragraph, we have an agreement that we are in a crisis. This perhaps, he said, that's qualified, but perhaps this country never saw so critical a period in their political concerns. We have felt the feebleness of the ties by which these United States are held together, and the want of sufficient energy in our present confederation to manage, in some instances, our general concerns. So there's an agreement that the Articles of Confederation are in some ways insufficient to manage the general concerns of the states, that they probably require some revision. But we haven't quite gotten here yet. Brutus is going to reject the present solution, even as he is not able to propose one himself.
So this is what's great, too, is we've seen in the different editions of the Federalist Papers that we've looked at, that opening sentence is either inefficiency or inefficacy of the present government, depending on which edition you're looking at. And you're pointing out to me, hey, Brutus and Publius agree that there is not sufficient energy in our present confederation to manage, in some instances, our general concerns. Publius is going to turn it up even louder. It's incapable of managing any of our general concerns, not just in some instances. So there's a qualifier that shows while Brutus and Publius seem to be on the same page, actually, Publius thinks that the crisis is graver because it's not merely limited to some instances, as we see here. I apologize for interrupting here.
No, and I think Brutus says quickly something that it took Publius 10 Federalist Papers to say explicitly, although it may have been implied. In our conversation about Federalist 10, we found Publius to say that men are political animals. The question about whether self-government is possible that emerges in the first and second paragraphs in Fed 1. And when we learn that men are political animals that are flourishing is tied up with self-government, that question then gains importance. But here, if we're thinking about the dignity of human nature, the possibility of the expansion of the human mind and knowledge and virtue, and the golden age's realization, Brutus puts that out on the table at the beginning. This isn't simply to do with forms of government, with the sovereignty of certain states. It's actually to do with human flourishing, period.
Yeah, we have rights listed here. Liberty, he speaks of, and then he says, to secure the inestimable rights of mankind and promote happiness. Brutus will speak of rights, plain as day. And look, he'll also speak of power. After he spoke of energy in paragraph 3, that line to which you and I gave so much attention, in paragraph 4, Brutus offers us something that I believe is true. I know it to be true in my experience. It's about halfway through that paragraph. And this is another way of trying to tell the American people to be very careful regarding not only the Constitution, but Brutus's arguments. He says the following: remember, when the people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again, but by force. So the problem of the existing Articles of Confederation is that they lack energy. So you must therefore give more powers to the Constitution so it may have energy to own up to our general concerns, is the logic here. I'm trying to piece together the logic between Publius and Brutus. Brutus, however, says, but remember, when a people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again, but by force. We're left with now this funny question. Well, where's the positive program? Where's your solution to the problem you admit in the third paragraph, Brutus? Perhaps it's a bit premature to ask him that question because we're only in the third and fourth paragraphs of Brutus 1, but it seems to me to be a sensible question for a student to have in mind here.
One of the things that jumps out from this paragraph that I think is extremely enticing to a certain kind of reader is Brutus seems to establish at the beginning a higher understanding of human nature than does Publius. Publius talks of glory, he talks of the dignity of man and liberty. But I'm not sure I ever hear Publius saying something like generations to come, if a right choice is made, will assert the dignity of human nature. And part of Brutus's political science seems to be that human nature is more exalted, and the forms of government maybe are less concerned with moderating vice than is Publius's. At least thinking about the work we've done so far with the Federalist.
And he's going to speak of founding here, Brutus will. Publius, I think, is a little more careful. Because, look, part of the reason of adopting a pen name, no matter if you're a Federalist or an anti-Federalist, is to try and demonstrate to your reader that you are not making these arguments out of your desire for self-aggrandizement, because you're hiding yourself. It's like you're not going to know it's me. It's just Brutus. As I said, we don't know which of the Yeats this might be. This might be Melanchthon Smith. So that's what they're doing. But imagine if Publius, as this champion of the Constitution, starts talking about everybody's going to love us for doing this awesome thing. Any sensible reader would say, wait a minute, they're going to love you because this is your Constitution. You are its chief proponent, it appears. And Publius instead, look, if you think back to Federalist Paper number 1, Publius is going to use language of deliberating, moderation, and then also interest. And he will talk about self-aggrandizement of others and their local interests that they could see being undermined. And that's a reason why they are against the adoption of the new Constitution. Personal interest. So Publius is talking about human nature in Fed 1. It's just the other side of the coin, I think. Is that fair, Aaron, what I say? Does that make sense?
I think that's right. I wonder if we can come back to the question we're thinking about how they understand political institutions.
Could you say more, please?
Sure. A system of government that says that ambition will counteract ambition. It will try to harness what is historically, classically, a political vice. It is different from one that says that people can handle their affairs in their local communities, and that kind of relationship is what will produce liberty, not, let's say, competition among what we might think of as political elites.
I think we could slow down a little bit on that last point. You might be right, but when I think about Federalist 51 and the way in which Publius supplies the defect in order to maintain the separation of powers, that is to secure liberty. That's right. It's to secure liberty in light of a government that has sufficient energy to meet its ends. And so that's a little bit different, I think, from our decision-making regarding to build a church, a road, property taxes, the self-government on the local level as it occurs day to day. But in terms of matters of federal concern, as understood in 1790, let's say, I think about it a little bit differently than you offered. When Brutus turns to his criticisms of the extended sphere, to use Publius's language, of existing under one federal head throughout these 13 states, he will say the interests are too varied. And everybody's just going to conflict with each other, and the cogs of government are going to be jammed up. Well, so that means Brutus thinks that on a local level, there will be similar interests, economic interests to be sure, he thinks. And this government can work, lawmaking can work, good government can be had. And therefore, ambition being made to counteract ambition, that stuff's not even on the page for him in his form of government, I don't think. What's remarkable is, what did the separation of powers look like inside of the state governments at this time? Just think Federalist 47 and 48, Publius starts cataloging separation of powers in the various state governments. I mean, for crying out loud, this is written to people of New York. New York at this time is the model of a separate executive power. So it still exists in state governments. Let me point out one more thing. So Brutus has tried to show us the importance of the matter. And he says at the end of the fourth paragraph, which rounds out his introduction, a sufficient reason to induce you to be careful. In the first instance, how you deposit the powers of government. The sufficient reason is once you give somebody power, they're not going to give it back. And the only way you're going to get it back is by force. It's interesting. Why would you have to get it back? That's actually a supposition. I love this line in paragraph 4 that I've read because I do think it's true. But what's interesting is, why do I need this power back? If I give the government the power to keep me safe, why would I ever be like, no, I need it back? Because they've broken the trust? Okay, that's right. But it's interesting if you were to say that government has broken the trust and therefore I should never entrust it with power. If you were to make that argument, I would say, man, you're more paranoid than John Locke, who starts speaking of trust so much in the double-digit chapters of the Second Treatise of Government. And then, of course, in chapter 19, discusses the right of revolution on this recognition. So maybe all Brutus is trying to do here is just remind us that we're playing with fire and therefore to be careful. And in light of reminding us of this and petitioning us to be careful, I will now move back to the second paragraph, because in asking us to be careful, Brutus is also to help us proceed with care. He says the following: in this situation, I trust the feeble efforts of an individual to lead the minds of the people to a wise and prudent determination cannot fail of being acceptable to the candid and dispassionate part of the community. Encouraged by this consideration, I have been induced to offer my thoughts upon the present important crisis of our public affairs. So Brutus is a caretaker. He's a humanitarian. He's a good citizen, and he's a good neighbor. He is encouraged by the consideration that the candid and dispassionate part of the community will find acceptable the determinations that he is making about the Constitution. So he thinks that the audience will be amenable because they are candid and dispassionate. You always have to worry, what about the passionate ones? That's a distinction here between Brutus 1, opening salvo, and Federalist 1. Publius admits there's going to be passions. There's going to be mixed motives. This is not a seminar room, this politics.
Yeah.
So maybe this is, now I'm really getting in the weeds, but maybe Brutus doesn't appreciate this about people enough. Maybe he doesn't appreciate this about politics, the necessity of meeting people where they are and admitting that they have less than rational motives and interests, but which nonetheless are ones that must be taken as seriously as anything else. So anyway, that's all I have to say about the opening bit here. Let's turn. You okay now to turn?
Yeah, let's do it.
Would you mind leading us off?
Yeah.
The first question, paragraph 6.
Sure. The first question that presents itself on the subject is whether a confederated government be best for the United States or not. Or, in other words, here we're thinking about what the term confederated means for him, whether the 13 United States should be reduced to one great republic, governed by one legislature, and under the direction of one executive and judicial, or whether they should continue 13 confederated republics, under the direction and control of a supreme federal head for certain defined national purposes only. When I teach this to high schoolers, I always say there's a mathematics problem involved. Are we going to have 14, 13 plus a supreme federal head, or one? We can have a United States, something like the Articles of Confederation, where a government is established for limited purposes, where the states share powers. We're going to learn in the ensuing paragraphs how Brutus imagines that administration happening. Or if you look at a map of the 13 colonies, will you see the lines between the states dissolved? Will those stars that mark the capitals in Annapolis and in Boston, Springfield, Columbia, will those just be replaced by dots marking big cities with now defunct state capitals?
What's at stake in this 13 or 1 question, liberty and happiness and the possibility of a golden age and blessedness, or misery by way of a subversion of liberty that would produce a tyrannic aristocracy? So the question's very, very serious. It's established in the previous paragraph. That question of number ultimately is a question of liberty and good government. And so now Brutus is going to offer us taxation as the way of starting to think about this stuff. I'm in paragraph 8, where he begins to discuss Article 1, Section 8, and then Article 6. Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution contains the necessary and proper clause, and Article 6 contains the supremacy clause. Brutus reminds his readers of them, and so I shall do the same. Brutus says, "This government is to possess absolute and uncontrollable power, legislative, executive, and judicial, with respect to every object to which it extends. For by the last clause of Section 8th, Article 1st, it is declared, quote, that the Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or office thereof." Brutus continues, "And by the 6th article, it is declared, quote, that this Constitution and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and the treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land, and the judges in every state shall be bound thereby, anything in the Constitution or law of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." He goes on to explain why this matters. Right now in Brutus 1, I think we would do well to think about Federalist Paper 15. At the same time, I'll explain. Brutus, after admitting the necessary and proper clause and the supremacy clause, says the following: "It appears from these articles that there is no need of any intervention of the state governments between the Congress and the people to execute any one power vested in the general government, and that the Constitution and laws of every state are nullified and declared void so far as they are or shall be inconsistent with this Constitution or the laws made in pursuance of it, or with treaties made under the authority of the United States." Publius' response is, yeah, that's right. As we saw in Federalist Paper number 15, we cannot have an empire within an empire. Confederated government is criticized at length by Publius precisely because of its inability to attain security. Now, that's not exhaustive of the ends of union and the Constitution, but in those papers, it's about security. And so you can't have state governments nullifying things done by the federal head, let alone treaties, for crying out loud. Publius will show us that a change in fundamental principles is necessary, that the federal government must operate directly on the individuals. It must leapfrog over the states and operate directly on individuals. And Brutus sees that as plain as day. Publius, as we have seen, argues this is good. This is what's needed. This is a way of dealing with the inefficacy of the existing Articles of Confederation in order to do what? Secure liberty. Brutus, not so much. He disagrees.
It's not merely about the ends of government and about imperium. For Publius it is, but Brutus is also concerned with the reality of administration, how laws are executed. And if we want to raise the challenge I raised earlier, that maybe Brutus understands something about the Constitution and its ends in the way that Publius doesn't. Here I'm bringing in the little paragraph 7, that although the government reported by the convention does not go to a perfect and entire consolidation, yet it approaches so near to it that it must, if executed, certain infallibly terminate in it. Then we need to think about how that administrative centralization might come about. He says, it appears from these articles, that is, Article 1, Section 8, and Supremacy Clause, that there is no need of any intervention of the state governments between the Congress and the people to execute any one power vested in the general government. So the decrees of the general government, the laws passed by the Confederation Congress, would have required enforcement by agents of the states. And of course, that creates a buffer between people and the national government that could then resist tyranny, because the national government needed the cooperation of the states. And certainly we saw during the Confederation period, certainly we'll see later on when we have the Constitution during the nullification crisis, during the crisis created by the Alien and Sedition Acts, that it's still a political constitutional idea that the states can use this kind of interposition to resist federal authority. That's sort of an assumption of the Confederation government. And that has extreme stakes. Brutus says later on, the powers of the general legislature extend to every case that is of the least importance. There is nothing valuable to human nature, nothing dear to freemen, but what is within its power. It has authority to make laws which will affect the lives, the liberty, and property of every man in the United States. There is no limitation to this power, he says, and it has the power to administer them. So when we hear Publius talking about the necessity of the national government being able to reach into the lives or the pockets of the American people directly, not by calling on the states to do so, not with any interference by the states, it's not only the ends that the government can extend that Brutus is so worried about, it's the means by which they are administered. And so when we think of the national government reaching through the historical and the constitutional prerogatives of the states in order to create efficacious government, that's the real concern of how the state's power is going to decline.
Yeah. Brutus concludes that no matter the way in which the proposed government is limited to certain objects, it is a complete one. It's not a confederation, and they will be able to lay taxes, imposts, and excises at their pleasure. He uses that language in the 8th paragraph. In the business, therefore, of laying and collecting taxes, the idea of confederation is totally lost, and that of one entire republic is embraced. It is proper here to remark that the authority to lay and collect taxes is the most important of any power that can be granted. It connects with it almost all other powers, or at least will, in process of time, draw all others after it. It is the great mean of protection, security, and defense in a good government, and the great engine of oppression and tyranny in a bad one. So you're giving all of this power to tax to this government. Now, sure, that power is needed in a good government for protection, security, and defense, but it's the great engine of oppression and tyranny in a bad government. So the question now is the proposed Constitution going to produce good government or bad government? Brutus does not quibble. In fact, quite the opposite. He establishes as a matter of fact that government must be able to tax. It's necessary. Now, Brutus is distinct from Publius insofar as Publius is obvious and very plain that the inability of the Articles of Confederation to tax is why we're in such dire straits. He speaks of it as harming our pride. It's a reason why other nations may justly make war with us, if you recall, when he discusses the just causes of war. So it makes for bad government, says Publius. Brutus has to now build the case that the Constitution will make for bad government. He's established it is going to be consolidated. It is going to produce 1, not 13 plus 1, but 1. Now he has to say it's going to make for bad government. Every candid man, as you pointed out, Aaron, must see that if it's capable of being executed by the federal government, the states will be annihilated, except where they're needed to help the federal government function. The state governments, it's worth pointing out, according to Brutus, will be unable to tax in turn, for you can't get blood from a stone. That is, there's only so much that can be taxed, according to Brutus. Little does he know. Therefore, the state governments will be lost to the federal government. And if that doesn't scare you, Aaron, Article 1, Section 8, paragraphs 10 through 16, grant the federal government the power to raise and support the Army and Navy. In times of war, yeah, that's right, but in times of peace as well. And it also grants the government the power to control the militia. I still always worry about this. What do you think? Do I make too much of it? In this 8th paragraph, Brutus says that the federal government shall be able to lay and collect taxes, imposts, and excises at their pleasure. Is the power of the federal government to lay and collect taxes a power to do so, quote, at their pleasure, as Brutus says? Is there no responsibility or accountability to the people and across the institutions? Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, let me jump around a little bit to get here. Brutus does not think much of the institutional means by which the Constitution limits power. Relevant to how he understands the government is this understanding of human nature and power that we've brought in a little bit before. A few paragraphs later, in number 12, he'll say, if the Congress may exercise the power of taxation to annihilate all the state governments and reduce this country to one single government, if they may do it, it is pretty certain they will. For it will be found that the power retained by individual states, small as it is, will be a clog upon the wheels of the government of the United States. The latter, therefore, will be naturally inclined to remove it out of the way. Besides, it is a truth confirmed by the unerring experience of ages, that every man and of every body of men invested with power are ever disposed to increase it, and to acquire a superiority over everything that stands in their way. This disposition, which is implanted in human nature, will operate in the federal legislature to lessen and ultimately to subvert the state authority, and having such advantages, will most certainly succeed, if the federal government succeeds at all. Publius's reply to this is that institutions will mollify this. The extended sphere, the separation of powers, checks and balances. So when we read, they are the sole judges, they, the legislators who have supplanted in their human nature this desire to increase their power at the expense of the states, I think, do they really have the ability to do this at their pleasure? Think of Federalist 9. We have the innovations in political science, bicameralism, the separation of powers, the fact that, thinking of Federalist, I think it is 57, bills for the raising of revenue have to originate in the House that gets turned over every 2 years. These are ways in which it doesn't exactly happen at their pleasure, but less important to the understanding of how this government will operate according to Brutus, and we might think, according to a French visitor who's going to come in the 1830s, is this understanding of human nature that will seem to run roughshod over the institutional arrangements that Publius so carefully lays and explains.
It's very important to note at this point that Brutus would view the 17th Amendment with horror, because you're talking now about how it is that the federal government itself is not going to operate at its own pleasure. You're right. But also, how is it not going to roll over the states? How is it that the states have any limitation that they're capable of placing upon the federal government as states? And in no small part, an answer could be offered that all of the Senate exists by way of the state's pleasure. The states are putting their senators in the federal Senate. We don't have that anymore. Now we have the direct election of senators. But that's another way where you can see that, hey, that move, that progressive reform, that is the 17th Amendment, actually comes at the expense of state power, and Brutus would argue local discretion regarding these matters. Also, I want to point out, with the paragraph you just read to us, Aaron, that bit you read from paragraph 12 is an understanding of the nature of human beings and power itself that Publius shares. Federalist Paper number 48. Publius will offer a very similar argument. It's this understanding of power that shows the insufficiency of mere parchment barriers for maintaining the separation of powers, and the need to supply the defect and have ambition counteract ambition, and the interests of the man being tied to the constitutional rights of the place. It's remarkable to see where it is that the two agree, Publius and Brutus, and yet then what they do with it.
You might also say something that Publius says in the papers that we've worked through, which is that legislators who are concerned with accumulating power, with this kind of grandeur that Brutus is worried about, are going to want nothing to do with internal administration. The things that the states are attached to, for example, the building of roads, any kind of internal state communication or infrastructure, is going to be of little desire for people who are animated by, let's say, the ruling passion of the noblest minds.
Is it right that if the federal government taxes as it pleases, then the state governments will have nothing left? Is it true that the federal government will make it impossible for the states to tax? Isn't there always meat on the bone in this regard? This fits with what you just brought to our attention. Won't there be local concerns not able to be met by the federal government that will, of necessity, call for local government and, as such, local taxation? Won't necessity produce this? Now, it doesn't mean that we won't have exorbitant tax rates. I think this is just another way in which you can see the concern for extremely limited and small government from Brutus. Let me ask you a third question and see if it can find purchase. Where's the limitation on the article's ability to tax? On paper, the Confederation can tax for purposes of war and the general welfare. I'll read to you now Article 8 of the Articles of Confederation. Quote, all charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States in Congress assembled shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several states in proportion to the value of all land within each state, granted to or surveyed for any person, as such land and the buildings and improvements thereon shall be estimated, according to such mode as the U.S. and Congress assembled shall from time to time direct and appoint. The taxes for paying that proportion shall be laid and levied by the authority and direction of the legislatures of the several states within the time agreed upon by the U.S. in Congress assembled. So the taxes shall be laid and levied by the state legislatures. But the charges for war and common defense nonetheless have to be paid by the states.
Well, and as we had occasion to note in our discussion of Federalist 9, as we will, God willing, have occasion to note in our discussion of Federalist 47, there is no separation of powers in the Articles of Confederation. There is less power of coercion, less power of taxation, no ability for the Confederation Congress to reach into the pockets of you and me. And at the same time, there are fewer limitations on that government as far as separation of powers creates limitations on that government.
My point, I agree with you completely. My point is as follows. Brutus has admitted the need for taxation for good government. He's admitted the danger of taxation, an engine of oppression in tyranny. The Articles of Confederation admits the necessity of taxation. The difference is that the states themselves levy it and lay it. As we know, this is no good. Requisitions are not sufficient for paying for common defense and general welfare. So the moment we admit that taxation is necessary for good government, and then upon inspection, observe that the Articles of Confederation are incapable of raising taxes to keep us secure, we must conclude that the Articles of Confederation, according to Brutus's own argument, produce bad government. Not because it produces a government that is necessarily tyrannical and robs us of our liberty, but that is incapable of owning up to the charges of good government, namely of keeping us secure. It's ineffective, as Brutus admits in the beginning of Brutus 1. So I'm trying to suggest that Brutus's argument is a bit difficult for me to understand. That's why I asked that second question. Is it truly possible that the states will no longer be able to tax because the federal government is going to get all of the water out of the well? That's why I asked that question. So what I want to say is the following. It seems silly to me to worry simply about the ability to tax for war and the general welfare. The point is that the proposed federal government has the power to do so without the state's consent. That's Brutus's problem. The Articles do not allow the Confederation to tax individuals or the goods they consume, only states, and states set the policy. Therefore, as we know, the government under the Articles could not effectively support the war effort. If we admit, as Brutus does here, that the power to lay and collect taxes is the great means of protection, security, and defense in a good government, then we must see the failure of the articles on this point, as I said, reveals them to be bad government because it can't own up to its fundamental purpose of security. So because Brutus admits that the taxing power is essential to good government, it's to be trusted in good government and feared in bad government, the question here is not whether something ought to have the taxing power and also the means of collecting those taxes. The question here is whether the proposed federal government is good or bad government. That's the question here.
And notice, as we're making a turn, he has, in his mind, established the reality that the government will proceed to a perfect and entire consolidation. Mm-hmm. Now he has to prove whether that is good or not. So he's laid the groundwork of his first question. Now he says, let us proceed to inquire whether it be best 13 United States should be reduced to one great republic or not. He moves on to say that all agree that whatever government we adopt should be a free one, that it should be so framed as to secure the liberty of the citizens of America, and such a one as to admit a full, fair, and equal representation of the people. So, what will produce these ends? The question will be whether a government thus constituted and founded on such principles is practicable and can be exercised over the whole United States, reduced into one state. His answer? No. He quotes some authorities here.
So right now we're in paragraph 14, I believe. Of course, this is a concern of size, as we've noted. Brutus turns to the opinion of the greatest and wisest men who have ever thought or wrote on the science of government. And he says, if we look at them and give these men's opinions some respect, we shall be constrained to conclude that a free republic cannot succeed over a country of such immense extent, containing such a number of inhabitants, and these increasing in such rapid progress, that of the whole of the United States. So Montesquieu is the authority here. This is Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws, Book 8. Quote, it is natural to a republic to have only a small territory, otherwise it cannot long subsist. In a large republic, there are men of large fortunes and consequently of less moderation. There are trusts too great to be placed in any single subject. He has interest of his own. He soon begins to think that he may be happy, great, and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens, and that he may raise himself to grandeur on the ruins of his country. In a large republic, the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 views. It is subordinate to exceptions and depends on accidents. In a small one, the interest of the public is easier perceived, better understood, and more within the reach of every citizen. Abuses are of less extent and, of course, are less protected. Of the same opinion is the Marquis Beccarii. That's an 18th century jurist and philosopher who wrote a lovely book in the mid-18th century called On Crimes and Punishments. Now, responsibility has already been mentioned by Brutus back there in paragraph 12. We must have representative government, Brutus asserts. And then after having representative government, you realize that the further away the representatives are from their constituents, the less responsible they are to the people. And furthermore, we must understand the greater variety of interests that any particular representative would take into consideration means also that they are less responsive to particular interests. I think what we can conclude from Montesquieu's Book 8 is that a republic must be small. That's the basic argument. And this is the only time that moderation is spoken of in Brutus 1. Moderation, that essential virtue for self-government, is lost as this thing gets bigger. Because as it gets bigger, I get greater fortunes, and as I become sort of divorced from or estranged from my community, I become, it seems, more selfish. So at the same time, it seems as if Republican virtue requires some sort of familiarity with each other so as to keep each other in check. Does it actually make us better out of our shared love for the noble and desire for honors? Or is it also keep us in check because of our fear of behaving shamefully? Probably both. And then in addition, we have to see there's a virtue now to be possessed by the people themselves in watching over their representatives. They're to have a sort of jealousy regarding their own liberty that is the engine of their keeping the representative responsible. So is responsibility like, hey, I have a responsibility to you, Aaron, and I come to you feeling responsible, according to Brutus? Or is responsibility here that I feel responsible to you because you're in my face all the time? You're micromanaging me, as we would say today. I'm always having to deal with you and your interests. And so the problem of size then, as Brutus here uses Montesquieu to articulate, is that once this thing gets big, everything gets estranged. And as the relationship between the constituent and the representative becomes estranged, or at least less familiar, responsibility dwindles. And responsibility is essential for keeping representatives good.
Yeah, I'd like to add, we live in a country that, partially due to the Constitution that has been adapted, is a great one. And it's great in size, as the military that has managed to sail across oceans and bestride continents, has the largest economy in the world. But there is a complaint by Brutus, it seems, against national greatness. In a large republic, there are men of large fortunes and consequently of less moderation. Here we're thinking about the virtue that you mentioned. There are trusts too great to be placed in any single subject. He has interest of his own. He soon begins to think that he may be happy, great, and glorious by oppressing his fellow citizens, and that he may raise himself to grandeur on the ruins of his country. Does not seem to be a problem that New York or Maryland possess, but a continental republic, in the way that Brutus understands it, not Publius. Question about how Montesquieu understands it that I think we have to get into. But that kind of greatness does not happen in the smaller republic. And a large republic contains that, I think, imperial ambition, what a later thinker will call family of the lion and the tribe of the eagle.
Look, those people are either going to free the slaves or enslave the free, Lincoln argues there in the Lyceum Address. And I'm here reading this in a New York newspaper, and I'm free and I don't want to be enslaved. So I don't want to open up the possibility of these people coming into being or coming into power. And so therefore, I'm keeping government local, small, and responsible. Because the solution Brutus seems to offer to all of these concerns is that the most potentially tyrannical aspects of government must be kept local to be kept responsible. And that what's necessary across state lines, therefore, must be limited, declawed, and defanged regarding domestic matters. That taxation power of coming directly into my neighborhood and putting imposts and excise taxes on all of this stuff can't exist, because it's going to produce tyranny, because those guys are far away and not responsible to us. And that seems to be rooted in human nature, as Brutus has established throughout paragraph 12, as you read to it previously, Aaron. But another truth here regarding power is that an entity must have power proportionate to its ends. If you want to accomplish something, you must have power to do so. I can't commission you with mowing my backyard and not grant you access to my property is my favorite example of this. Now, if the federal government, the union, is to keep us safe from foreign threats and provide for the general welfare, then it must have money. And if it must have money, then it must have the power to raise money. It must be granted permission to access my property as fitting to its commission. The experience under the Articles of Confederation shows that leaving this to the states and only making requests upon the states is not sufficient for owning up to this chief end of government, namely security. So what do you think of this? Does potential tyranny from this federal government force us to reject this axiom that power must be proportionate to the ends if you hope to attain those ends? Does the potential tyranny force us to throw the baby out with the bathwater? Are there means other than proximity by which to keep government responsible? And you've already pointed out a few of them, Aaron. When you were thinking of Fed 57, what is it? Whether the few shall be aggrandized at the expense of the many, that's directly about taxation power, Fed 57. And there Publius offers us 5 safeguards. Ultimately, it's the vigilant and manly spirit of the people. But my point here is, are there means other than proximity by which to keep government responsible?
It's funny, he seems to have an understanding of the separation of powers as it applies to England. In paragraph number 23, he says, England, where standing armies depend upon the Parliament for their annual support, they've always been complained of as oppressive and unconstitutional, and are seldom employed in executing of the laws. never except on extraordinary occasions and then under the direction of a civil magistrate. So there, a standing army relies on the support of Parliament, on the support of popular government. It is a more class-based, I think, understanding of the separation of powers. But if the standing army relied solely on the authority of the executive, then it would run roughshod over the rights of the people. It would be a despotic government. I don't think he's calling England there a despotic government. I think standing army depends on its support for Parliament means that it in some way takes this necessary end, the execution of the laws, and puts it in the hand of a responsible branch of government that can then check the authority that will command the standing army. So there is a separation of, there is an understanding of the separation of powers and how it conduces to freedom here. He just doesn't apply that understanding to the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, his argument instead is as follows. If this government is free, you must assent to the laws. Because the other option is that you only, quote, assent to the laws by way of fear of the standing army putting their bayonets into your back. But what he says is, in paragraph 18, in a large extended country, it is impossible to have representation possessing the sentiments and of integrity to declare the minds of people, without having it so numerous and unwieldy as to be subject in great measure to the inconveniency of democratic government. So once it gets big, it's just going to be too factious. It's going to be too democratic. And this is worth pointing out now, as he thinks about, in paragraph 19, the number of people in America. He points out 3 million of souls and is capable of containing much more than 10 times that number. Yeah, the 2025 population of the United States is something like 340 million people. And he says, is it practicable for a country so large and so numerous as they will soon become to elect a representation that will speak to their sentiments without their becoming so numerous as to be incapable of transacting public business? It certainly is not. And therefore, the only option is that you'll have laws that you're not going to assent to because they're not going to be made in light of your interests. This is the limited understanding of responsibility offered by Brutus here. The government is to be responsible to you, which is to say it's not supposed to act in any way except what you deem as your interest. But once it gets bigger, especially because, as he argues in paragraph 20, the people are too diverse, interests are not going to be met. He says, in a republic, the manners, sentiments, and interests of the people should be similar. If this be not the case, there will be constant clashing of opinions, and the representatives of one part will be continually striving against those of the other. This will retard the operations of government and prevent such conclusions as will promote the public good. You know, of course, Publius's response. This is a bizarro, whichever one you want me to say is bizarro. One of these two, Federalist 10 or Brutus 1 at this point, is bizarro, Superman. It's exactly opposite. The feeding in of more interests and a greater number of people, which is to say representative government in an extended sphere, is Publius's cure to majority faction. Here, Brutus argues that will make the government make laws that aren't in your interests, which they will then be forced to enforce via fear and armies. There's no concern here about faction. Both Brutus and Publius are concerned with liberty and the government taking away your liberty by way of the laws it makes. But here, the liberty that Brutus is concerned with is just your interests being met, without any statement on whether or not your interests come at the expense of the rights of others or the permanent and aggregate interests of the community, right? Even though Brutus talks about rights and talks about the public good, he doesn't think about the government making laws that are against the public good because of a majority. He doesn't think about that here. It's just simply, if they don't know your interests, they can't make laws that you're going to voluntarily follow. And so therefore, they're going to have to force you to do so. Hence, paragraph 24, a free republic will never keep a standing army to execute its laws.
One of the differences here is that Publius does not accept the point that the national government will develop an interest of its own, an interest that applies against the states, an interest that's inimical to the states. The conversation about faction in Federalist 10 seems to supply his understanding as to why. Brutus, in seeing the power available to the national legislatures, to the federal Congress, seems to think that that their interest will be to increase the power there, and that other concerns, for example, those of, as he mentions, of people of different manners, sentiments, will not obviate that.
He even goes into, it's perfectly Montesquieuian. Brutus goes into, in paragraph 20, the United States includes a variety of climates. Because of the variety of climates, then it's not simply that you and I would argue we have different mores. It's rather the productions of the different parts of the Union are very variant, and their interests of consequence diverse. Publius is talking with him in Federalist 10 on this point.
Mm-hmm.
Remember how much interests there in that paragraph are about economic interests, and a chief end of government is the protection of human beings and their different faculties that lead to differences in property. So they agree about so much, Brutus and Publius. They just disagree about what to do about these things. Nonetheless, Brutus's warning is very clear. The consequence of having this government where the people are incapable of having confidence in their rulers because it's so extensive means that the people will know that their representatives are not responsible to the people for their conduct, and then they will have power to displace the people whenever the people, quote, misbehave. Brutus uses that language. But in a republic of the extent of this continent, the people in general would be acquainted with very few of their rulers. The people at large would know little of their proceedings, and it would be extremely difficult to change them. He concludes there as follows. This is paragraph 24. The consequence will be they will have no confidence in their legislature, suspect them of ambitious views, be jealous of every measure they adopt, and will not support the laws they pass. Hence, the government will be nerveless and inefficient, and no way will be left to render it otherwise but by establishing an armed force to execute the laws at the point of the bayonet, a government of all others the most to be dreaded. How is the government nerveless? What does it mean to be nerveless? You lack feeling. You lack contact. You don't sense things. And so this government will be nerveless. It's not that it's incapable of acting, but it doesn't have any ability to sense the will of the people. And in fact, it doesn't even care about them, we're led to believe, because of its own self-concerns, it being occupied by human beings who aren't even worried about what their constituents have to think. It gets bigger and it gets number to the point where, numb is the word I said, to the point where Brutus thinks it's actually nerveless. And it's inefficient. It's inefficient in a way because it's clogged up with all of these varying interests. It's just jammed up. And when it's all jammed up and it can't work because of how inefficient it is, it cannot meet the public good. You and I know Publius say that means it can't go against the public good. That inefficient government means that whenever it actually gets something done, it should be more in accord with what the nerves can sense, while it's not a raw nerve open to all of the fleeting passions of the many. It's at least a tiny bit removed, above them, buffered, capable of sensing the true interests of the community, to where when it actually produces something, it's capable of meeting what we might describe as good law or good government. So I'm not trying to say one of the two is right at this point. I'm just trying to show you how it is that the two are disagreeing with each other. Federalist 10 there from Publius and Brutus 1 here at this point. One of them says, Brutus, this stuff is going to produce tyranny. Publius says, without these safeguards, you're going to have tyranny. Extended sphere breeds tyranny, says Brutus. Extended sphere is the solution, along with representation, to majority tyranny.
Moving toward paragraph 27, he begins his conclusion. These are some of the reasons by which it appears that a free republic cannot long subsist over a country of the great extent of these states. If then this new constitution is calculated to consolidate the 13 states into one, as it evidently is, ought not to be adopted. Mike, what does calculated there mean to you? Calculated to me seems not that it will produce the outcome based on an accident, but that it is actually meant, it is intended to effectuate a consolidation.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I see what you mean when you say that way. It's calculated, but the calculation could be also all of the math, to stick with the image, that Brutus has been doing this entire time, beginning with, and if you want to keep thinking about numbers, 13 or 1, and then we go Article 1, Section 8, and then we go Article 6. So he's looking at all of these numbers throughout this thing and showing how it is that from those numbers, certain powers are granted, which inevitably will produce a consolidated government, which will suffocate the state governments. And then as the math of Brutus 1 continues, we realize that the bottom line is a loss of liberty. If you want to be crazy, aristocratic tyranny or tyranny. There's no critique of the rule of the many here. The critique is implicit in all of this by way of the necessity of having representative government because of the inefficiency of democratic government in states of these sizes. And then by way of the arguments for responsibility, Brutus allows us to see the patent distrust he has in all government and in all men. Responsibility here is a leash, and it's not one of those nice like leashes that goes over the rib cage of a dog that doesn't choke it. It's one of those terrible leashes that's like metal chains with little hooks coming out of them. You ever seen those things? They're terrible. You see them on like Rottweilers and pit bulls. It's that kind of leash, and it's short. There's no responsibility here in terms of caretaking, understanding the interests of the American people better than they understand themselves. There's a patent distrust of men and power in Brutus's science of politics. Though, he says in the final paragraph, though I am of opinion that it is a sufficient objection to this government to reject it, that it creates the whole union into one government under the form of a republic, yet if this objection was obviated, there are exceptions to it, which are so material and fundamental that they ought to determine every man who's a friend to the liberty and happiness of mankind not to adopt it. I beg the candid and dispassionate attention of my countrymen while I state these objections. If I may interrupt, that candid and dispassionate attention is something that he called on back in the opening paragraphs. That's the way we're to approach this. Moderation is what Publius wants from us. He wants us to be candid, frank, and also dispassionate. Brutus continues, they are such as have obtruded themselves upon my mind upon careful attention in the matter, and such as I sincerely believe are well-founded. There are many objections of small moment, of which I shall take no notice. Perfection is not to be expected in anything that is the production of man. And if I did not in my conscience believe that this scheme was defective in the fundamental principles and the foundation upon which a free and equal government must rest, I would hold my peace. So it's not some specific here or there's about the Constitution that render it not worthy of our ratification. Rather, it's the fundamental principle of the Constitution, namely the principle that it ought to operate directly on individuals and be supreme over the states. Publius and Brutus disagree fundamentally. That's a first principle of good government. Publius allows us to see after that tour throughout all of those petty republics of antiquity and ancient confederations and even modern confederations. Brutus and Publius are on opposite sides regarding this. And so you have to decide whether or not Brutus's understanding of state government and responsibility there and interests being met trumps Publius's concerns over safety and the general welfare, as we've discussed in Federalist Papers 1 through 23.
Yeah. Well, look, we're not done with Brutus. I think we want to turn to Brutus number 6 next.
Yeah, if you look at him, I mean, golly, the guy, he wrote quite a few, and he goes on to discuss things. You know, we skipped over the judiciary in Brutus 1. He discusses the judiciary quite a bit. I mean, upon studying, for instance, Montesquieu, you see he turns to the judiciary first in his assessment of political liberty of a place, because that's where the law actually sinks its teeth into you. We think it's the cops pulling you over and throwing you in the back of the car. It's the judiciary. It's the judge throwing you under the jail. And then the supremacy of the federal judiciary over the state judiciary only further estranges the people from the laws and emboldens the federal government to make laws divorced from local concerns, Brutus would argue. And so that's always worth keeping in mind, that as much as Brutus is going to talk about the legislature, its taxing power, and the armies, he's also going to talk about the judges who are carrying out its laws. But there's also, we could talk about Bill of Rights if we were ever interested in doing so. We could talk about those letters between Madison and Jefferson on the Bill of Rights, and then the anti-Fed arguments for a Bill of Rights. Representation is dealt with considerably in Brutus's 3 and 4. And so we could talk about representation more. And then finally, 6 also is with armies. So yeah, that sounds good. Well, anyway, Aaron, what a long and winding road Brutus
really.
1 is.
Starting from RoboCop to consolidation and taxes, administration. We still haven't killed a Caesar yet.
I was about to say the corniest thing I could imagine. I had a Caesar salad last night.
So did I. I think I opened the episode telling you about it, or at least I opened our recording.
Oh yeah, you had a Caesar salad. Yeah, well, you had a so there's the corny joke. You had a Caesar salad with
hash browns on top.
Hash browns. They were they home fries or were
No,
they like tater tots?
Little shredded potatoes.
Oh, and they were fried.
Yeah, instead of browns.
That's lazy. I don't. I guess I should ask you if it was good rather than just be a jerk.
It was very good. It wasn't cheap either.
It's DC. Aaron, it was great seeing you. Thanks for talking with me about Brutus 1. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
You too. Thanks, Mike.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.